that for Enterprise Linux for a few years, and now I've moved into engineering. Sometimes I jokingly refer to it as they got tired of me complaining and said, now go fix. So that was relatively recently. But I come from a background of being a software consultant mostly to lots of Fortune 100 kind of companies, mostly in financial services and pharmaceutical. So that means a lot of insurance, a lot of stock exchanges, and stock brokers, and fund management, and that kind of stuff. It's kind of the FS side. And then the pharma side, it was actually weird because what we mostly dealt with was sales. So it was really financial services, just happened to be inside pharmaceutical companies. Although I did work in like some of the R&D labs as well. Mostly what I've done is I refer to it as kind of really complicated websites. So not sounding in some ways very hard. However, we had really interesting transactional requirements. I actually worked on the first ever currency exchange that was online. Did a lot of work with what used to be referred to as T+1, which is basically doing trades in one day. So I have kind of a really weird background. But as a consumer of Linux and Windows, and as much as I could avoid it, Mac, instead of being somebody who really kind of built things inside operating systems, I mostly built things on operating systems. So I'm here to talk about what it's like to use Fedora as somebody who builds things on operating systems. Wow, that's a huge difference. All right, so first and foremost, if you guys saw any of the other talks kind of roughly related to the workstation, there's a kind of a going trend that the desktop is dead. And as you can see from my brief search here, it seems to be not very clear which way it's going, right? Oh
my god, also
yeah, I thought it was actually kind of a funny search result. But whatever. So, why I usually use DuckDuckGo for this kind of thing is that you could search this and get the same results, unlike, say, Google. But I guess my particular position is that I see incredibly, or much stronger use of kind of tablet-oriented, kind of operating systems towards consumerization. And so kind of you take management kind of people, you take sales kind of people, you take, my grandmother, who despite being dead still uses a computer. Mostly they're consumers. They're mostly consuming kind of the internet or consuming, email or whatever. And that kind of operating system tends to be more towards like the tablet model. And so my argument is that we as a kind of community should really go after a niche market. And the reason we should go after a niche market is because, Fedora has been seeing this kind of decline. Kind of desktop OSs in general have been seeing kind of a decline. And from the startup world, which I also do a bunch of startups, if you take a niche and really go after that niche, it has been shown to kind of be easier to kind of spread beyond the niche than it is to kind of say, okay, we're going to solve everyone's problems and try to actually generate kind of marketing buzz around that. So, and so there's a little link to an Entrepreneur Magazine article. There's tons of other stuff about this, kind of lean startup. Go read HBR, talks about this kind of stuff a lot too. And so kind of at the end of the day, what I want to be doing with something like Fedora, and actually just for kind of terms. When I say developer, kind of from here on out in this talk, I'm mostly talking about people like me versus people who build OSs, right? And when I say Fedora here, I am pretty much talking about workstation. So just because I'll probably shorten it. So I think we can kind of go after the people who are creating things. Okay, and I would argue that we want to start with a really nice niche that has a couple advantages. One, there is no operating system right now that really targets developers as a user base. Most operating systems that we deal with are actually actively built to be more difficult for developers to use, right? Because they try to hide all the things the complexities that we need to use all the time. And so I think we have an opportunity to actually build something for a group of users who are actively seeking kind of a new environment. And so I think if you start with that group, then you can also then expand to other kinds of creatives, right? So I don't know, maybe it's graphic artists, right? Or maybe it's writers. I don't know, lots of different kinds of people. But if we kind of start with a niche, then we can expand from that, and it's a lot easier to generate buzz and market and that kind of stuff around one particular niche. So that's kind of my basic tenet. So now what I want to do is talk about, okay, so developers are often grouped in one big lump, right? But they're actually really, really different. So I try to put some together. A bunch of the companies I worked for had very strong user experience groups. And so I learned enough to recognize that really strong user experience is really important, and user-centered design is really important, and just enough for it to annoy the ever when it's bad, but not enough to actually fix it. So one of the things that I try to do is kind of take that user-centered approach a little bit, and start with things like personas, and then think about user scenarios, and then kind of extrapolate from there into something that I could talk to somebody who actually can do design about what I want in kind of the same way. So we have, I kind of have three different groups here. So we have, on this page we have enterprise, next page is small shop kind of developers, and then the page after that is kind of special case. So in the enterprise, this has mostly been, a lot of this is from my experience and from my friends who kind of are in this space. And as a consultant, right, you run into a lot of people. I think a lot more than you do working for any other kind of company. So this has been kind of my experience. So you have, like C and C++ developers, there's less and less new stuff happening in C and C++. It's turning a lot more into like maintenance work. That maintenance work might be really hard and really important and really actually pay really well, but it's a lot more maintenance work than it is new applications. Really, in the enterprise, Java has just completely won, right? I mean, Java is just the thing. With the possible exception of kind of the Windows side of the world with C#. If you've never looked at C#, C# was basically built as a reaction to Java, and does a much better job with event handling, mostly because Microsoft in general has always done event handling really well. The other thing that's really up and coming, at least in my experience, has been PHP. I kind of half jokingly, half seriously refer to PHP as the VB of the modern world. So you get a lot of people who don't come from computer science background. They come from, they wrote a bunch of macros in Excel, and eventually they got to the point where they're like, oh, I can do this programming thing. Now what they do is they start with PHP rather than starting with what used to be Visual Basic. So people who do a lot of development work and real development work, but with very little of kind of the formal background and training of real computer science. So you end up with a lot of really weird PHP applications. Feel free to yell out questions, whatever, disagreements, make fun of me on Twitter. So the next group, which I think is also really interesting because the kind of small shop mentality is really on the rise. So you take banks, right? I know something about banks. Companies like Simple.com, which is basically an online bank, and even E-Trade, right? Kind of another online bank, although they built brick and mortar too. But these little tiny, very fast moving, easy to pivot are becoming in some ways the new enterprise of the world. But they usually look more like these kind of profiles. You still see a lot of Java, but that's because like somebody left, not Merrill Lynch anymore, Bank of America, and and started a small shop. But what they did was Java, so now they do Java. And then you get a lot more kind of newer applications, younger developers, and they'll be doing things like Ruby and PHP. Python is definitely on the rise as far as kind of web development and application development. But I don't think I've ever seen an application like in my career that was Python based that was like a web application that was in production. Or like a
Fedora. Everything in Fedora infrastructure.
Right. By any of these kinds of companies, commercial entities. It's not entirely true, and like I said, it's anecdotal, right? So there's definitely companies I haven't seen that probably do this stuff, but I don't know very many people who do it, except recently, past year or two. It's really starting to change. Things like Flask in particular. Python seems to be what most people think really understand the micro framework well. I also think Python is also starting to grow as well because what we don't call SOA anymore, so service-oriented architecture, we now call microservices. Is basically a Unix-style development. Is I have a little service and a little service, and I connect them together to do something useful. I think people think that Python people get that better, and so the kind of tool chains are better for that stuff. I don't know. So the next one is kind of the special cases. These kinds of guys, this is where you still see a lot of like C and C++, but even that's changing. You're starting to see things like R, being more commonly used in like hedge funds. And then casual programmers, scientists, researchers, academics in general. Basically, there's almost no field of study really that you can get away with not being able to program if you do any kind of analysis of data. So most of them, at least the ones I've always run into, have been mostly using Python.
You should put Fortran on that list.
Yeah.
I'm serious. It sounds like a joke, but if you're actually doing HPC, you're just like use Fortran.
I just want to block it out, that's all. Yeah, no, Fortran should probably be here too. And actually it might have been in one of the earlier versions. But yeah, Fortran should probably be in there. But arguably, in my mind, right, if we want to go after kind of a niche market, these are the least important, right? It's like, if we go after things like kind of big Java enterprise developers, or more interestingly, I think, actually is the cool kids, right? So the people doing Ruby and PHP and doing kind of new and cutting edge applications like Simple.com, like Facebook. They're doing really high-end development stuff, but they're using a lot of the cool new tools. I think Python could be in that bucket just as easily, rather than the more traditional languages like Java and C, C++. The one kind of interesting exception, I think, is, and I think maybe I need to change the slide around because Go is really coming up fast in the people I talk to, which I find odd, but people writing little, again, microservices, using Go for the performance, but the ease of use of a kind of a higher level language than C++.
Also, they love that it's statically linked.
Right, right.
HPC and statically linked.
Exactly. All right, so next thing is, okay, so when we talk about the personas, lots of different kind of user group, different types of developers out there. So what I like to think about next is, okay, so what do we see as things that kind of go across those groups? So what are the commonalities? Because I think if we wanted to say tomorrow, we will build the best possible environment for Python developers on the web, I think that's actually a huge task, right? So I think it's easier if we can kind of look at some of the stuff that's more cross-cutting concerns and figure out some of the little pieces that we can kind of do to kind of move up that stack, rather than trying to say, here's this monster, of a mountain and let's go after it. So this is kind of one of the ways I was thinking about is, this is some common concerns that a lot of developers have, of all different types. And what I feel like is that these are what the needs are that we need to make sure we kind of cover. And I'll definitely put the slides up. I saw somebody taking a picture of the slide, but I'll put the slides up somewhere so you can get them. So you guys can all read, so I won't read them to you, but these are a lot of the concerns that I hear about, and often why people choose the environment that they use. And they have all kinds of crazy hacks to avoid these problems, right? Using Git for your entire Etsy, right? Is basically to solve this saving your configuration problem. But everybody's got their own little version, right? And everybody does it slightly different ways. I feel like we could solve some of these problems. So I had to use this. In Prague, there is a university called Unicorn College, and I was like, I'm sorry, but this has to go in my slides. So I apologize to Unicorn College for putting a big red, X across them, but these I think are common misconceptions about kind of typical developers, right? That they screw around with how the look and feel of their desktop is all the time. I know some who do, but I don't think I've even changed my background. I don't even know if I know where to go to change my background because I could care less. That developers hate security, right? Because every single time you turn around, right, it's like, wait, somebody had the Set Enforce shirt on. Everybody turns off SE Linux, right? Everyone turns off the firewalls if they're developers. But they don't do it because they don't want their machine to be secure. They do it because it takes too long and it's too hard for them to figure out how to configure it such that it will let them do what they want, right? Because every time you get HTTPD from your RPM install, it's set up for a productionalized environment, right? Which if you're trying to do development on it, like you want to do a website, is a huge pain, right? Because it's all locked down and you can't get to it. You got to do chones all the time and all this stuff, and so it's just easier a lot of the time. Just turn off the firewall, turn off SE Linux, and just go, right? The other one is that every developer hates IDEs and every developer loves IDEs, depending on which side of that fence you're on. What I've found is that IDE use seems to be related a lot more to kind of language than it is, and generally first language that you use, than it is to almost anything else. So if you started in Java, you tend to use Eclipse, and you like to use Eclipse for everything else, no matter how good it is at doing that. The other really interesting article I read not too long ago about this debate was that if you tend to use cutting-edge languages and libraries and things like that, you tend to be more text editor-based, or programmer's editor-based, than IDE-based, because the IDE hasn't caught up to actually give you the support that it would give you for an older language. And so I thought that was also an interesting argument. So the other thing I think is also a common misconception is that most programmers like technology. So they might like toys, right? They might like their phones or their tablets or their whatever, or this swanky new laptop. But lots and lots of developers really, really don't care about doing development as kind of a life mission, right? That's why, or that's not the only reason probably, but at least some of the reason why there's lots of developers who don't participate in open source at all, right? It's because when they go home, they, fix their motorcycle, right? Or they, play video games, or they read books, or they play with their kids, or whatever. The bulk of those people out there are it's just a job, right? They go to work 9 to 5, they happen to do programming, but they really don't care about this stuff. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because I think almost by definition, if you're at this conference, if you're in this kind of environment, you're the opposite of that. And so it's really hard sometimes to build things for people who are completely distinct from you. As actually, I think it was in Christian's talk that he did, was it yours, that you were talking about, trying to think about use cases that are not your own. I don't know, somebody's talk. So the other thing is that it's getting increasingly difficult to only use one programming language in your job. So even in the big Java houses, there's more and more adoption of things like PHP in particular, but also things like Ruby and Python. And it is not uncommon for developers to have to switch languages, sometimes during the day, more than once in a day. And so encouraging tools to make those transitions simpler, I think is really important. This apparently was enough of interest, right, that I did a talk specifically about polyglot developers, which is the term for it, right? So people who speak multiple programming languages at OSCON, right? And it was accepted, right? I was a little surprised, actually. All right, so there's all that. So here's some ideas about maybe some kinds of things that we could do that would solve some of these problems and provide some sort of solutions. So one of the things that I've been thinking about, and a bunch of these I've been trying to kind of do on my own with greater and lesser success to see if they really test out and work. But what if you could put all of your development tools inside a container? So a typical use of a container for like a web developer, right, is to plop a web server into a container and then deploy your application onto it. But what if you actually put, say, Vim in the container? If you put a Git, server in a container, and maybe you put, I don't know, your web browser cache in the container, and I don't know, a bunch of other different stuff. All the different things that you use as a developer, could you actually put those inside a container? Then that container would be independent from the actual operating system. So you could, when Fedora 21 comes out, you could blindly just whack your OS and reinstall it, and it would be no big deal because everything you care about is sitting in this container and you could drop it on the new machine or the new instance. So this is a little orthogonal to typically how you use containers, because I would actually say I want to put a bunch of different services inside one container, and normally what you talk about is like you do one service per. But then you can do some other interesting things like, I was talking about kind of breaking your OS. I regularly do this. This is probably because I'm an awful sysadmin. So if I want to try some new tool, it might be nice to be able to install it someplace where I can roll back from, without having to worry about rolling back the whole operating system, right? I can just roll back this one tool chain. Or for different projects, I was talking about being polyglot, right? So when I'm doing a Drupal development site, there are certain plugins I want for Firefox that I don't want for WordPress development, right? So it might be nice if I could actually branch my tools and have them actually all have basically a history, right? So those are some ideas around that. And then I think this is an obvious one, encourage containers, kind of in the more traditional way to use for your local unit testing. And then the next one that I really think would be interesting is, and I didn't really touch on this worry that much, but the other huge problem you have as kind of an everyday developer is that your boss comes along and changes what you're supposed to be doing and says, oh, whatever you were working on, you need to stop doing that right now and go work on this mission critical bug. Problem with that is, there's actually been many books written about the amount of time you lose during context switching, particularly for programmers. There was actually a classic Microsoft management book that was why all Microsoft developers had a door, so they all had offices. And the reason was because they had done some research that said that if a guy comes and asks you a question and you answer that question, that's like 30 seconds for the guy who asked the question, right? But the person who was answering the question is 15 minutes to get back to where you were. And that there's a huge drop in the likelihood that a guy will come ask you a question if the door is shut. So it was really interesting. And if I can remember the name of the book, I would tell you to go read it. But it was
on software.
No, it was actually a published Microsoft book. Joel probably wrote about it too, but yeah, it was earlier than Joel. So one of the things that I've thought about for a long time is, if you think about the desktop metaphor, which is what we use for most of our computer kind of operating system designs, personally, I think the whole concept is kind of backwards and weird and never should have been a good idea in the first place. Because if you actually work at a desk, right, and you think about how your desk is set up, and you normally have piles of stuff around your desk. And when you want to work on a task, you pick up the pile, and you kind of spread it out, and then work on that thing. So you have a pile of bills, right? You have a pile for your taxes, you have a pile for something else. And when you go to work on your bills, you take that pile out, you kind of spread it out, and do whatever you're supposed to be doing. And then when you stop, you kind of close the pile back up, and you put it over there, and then you work on your taxes for a while. So wouldn't it be nice if you could kind of say, instead of thinking about a desktop being kind of a bunch of different applications, what if we were actually thinking about them as tasks, right? So every time you want to do anything, it's always a task, right? So I need to book my travel for Flock, right? Or I need to work on bug number 27. I've never had an application that had that many few bugs, but I want to go work on buying my kids' Christmas presents. Those are all individual tasks, and they all have state, right? And I may or may not get interrupted in the middle of it. So wouldn't it be kind of cool if you could kind of save off where you were on that task and then go on to another one. Or as another kind of a variant of that is, wouldn't it be nice if you could actually have kind of multiple tasks open that you're kind of switching between because you're multitasking for whatever reason. Maybe you're waiting for compiles to happen or something like that. Could you actually have multiple applications involved in one particular task with save state that you could switch between? Either you could have multiple ones running concurrently, or you could just kind of switch between them on a weekly basis, right? So that's kind of the task stuff. Another huge problem I think is getting increasingly bad is most kind of like developers these days are running multiple machines or multiple containers or whatever for one application, right? So, you know, a friend of mine wrote up an application that I think even in like dev kind of requires 6 servers, like all kind of running at once, because again, it uses that kind of microservices model, and you don't want to run all of that on one machine because you won't know if you broke stuff because, you know, it needs to communicate across the network. So, but in order to set up that kind of configuration, you need to know a lot about how networking works, and most developers don't know jack about how networking works. And I would like to see something like Open vSwitch, right? Having a nice GUI on top of it that I could just draw little lines and say, this machine can talk to that machine and that one over there, and have that just work, rather than having to figure out what bridging is and how that works, because I don't know. Another big one, this is particularly in the Linux world, or actually even just in our ecosystem. It's very difficult to, as a kind of a developer kind of person, to get your local file system kind of available. Right? It's like it's hard not to drop into one particular implementation, but available inside a container or inside a VM, or what's more likely, I think, going forward, is you're going to want to have your local file system available inside of a VM, which is then in turn passing that file system to individual containers. And that's really hard to set up right now, no matter what way you do it. Another big thing is we want to make kind of low-end developers, right? So if you think about developers being, kind of on a curve, you have the gurus out here, for you guys right out here, but you have the gurus out here, and the guys who are kind of just to the right of the hump, right? They want to be like the gurus, but they don't quite have the sophistication to actually do it. So one of the big things that's, so what we want to do is kind of help those guys who are to the right of that hump be cooler. And so if we kind of can help them follow the latest trends, so, Docker, right? But things like continuous integration and continuous delivery, right? Things like test-driven development, trust-driven design. God forbid we could encourage more user-centered design. But can we figure out ways to, and I don't know if Jenkins is the right answer, but can we figure out ways to get Jenkins, kind of available in your desktop, as part of your normal development workflow without the headache of setting up Jenkins, right? So there are ways we can do things like that so we can support developers doing what's kind of the latest thinking in good programming methodology. I'm deeply disappointed that there's not more yelling and screaming. And then I touched on this a little bit before. It was funny. The first time I ever installed I think it was HTTPD, HTTPD-devel, I was incredibly disappointed because I thought it was going to be set up so that I could do development on it. But no, it's set up so that I could build and write HTTPD, right? I was like, devel, that sounds perfect. So one of the things I think is really interesting that's going on with kind of the role stuff on the Fedora server is that maybe we can have ways of doing alternate configurations depending on the target, right? So if you're on workstation, instead of getting HTTPD built for production deployment, you'll instead get it built for doing development on and basically mounts your, some local project directory into var-dub-dub instead of it being actual var-dub-dub. It runs under your user, right, instead of root or Apache. The other thing that I like about that is that then somebody who actually knows something about security, Dan Walsh, will be the one who designs how that gets set up. And I won't just have to try to hack at firewall D and try to make the ports open and invariably, I'm sure, leave monster holes in my machine. All right, so some things that we can do right now, is kind of like let's try to stabilize in Workstation, right? Let's try to make it so that people are able to build things for our desktop that is around development that are stable, right? And so I kind of think like, let's lock down GNOME, for example, on Workstation for a while so that people can build things against it and deploy them and have some confidence that they'll be able to last for a while.
That's just a short-term band-aid.
Sorry?
That's just a short-term band-aid. We will need to upgrade, and if that is breaking stuff, then it will just break 6 months later. It will need.
Well, the other thing is that we can also encourage from the upstreams, right? We can say, hey, we need backwards compatibility for this, otherwise we can't upgrade, right? Things like that. The other thing is kind of like, the rings stuff, right, from Matt's talk last year. Is there ways we can make things get into Fedora more easily, right, at kind of lower barriers to entry that then can grow till the point where they're considered safe and useful and that kind of stuff, and really have a structured program for that. I had to use the word ambassador because I couldn't think of another one, but can we have a program where we reach out to components and teams proactively and talk to the Node.js guys before they get into this monster package review cycle, right? And actually get the cutting edge tools and components available to the desktop users of Fedora, even though they're relatively insecure or statically linked or whatever, with kind of big warnings that say, hey, you got to be careful of this stuff. Another one is path for software as a service applications to also be kind of integrated into the desktop. And I know some of the desktop team is working on this, but kind of really have a formalized plan. This might be Chrome apps, but I don't want to say just Chrome apps, right? It could be any kind of things like this. But really actually have a way that those get a path into the desktop, right? So that they can actually become part of your actual operating system, even though they're remote. And then the last thing is, let's really start to gather data about users and market and really understand what people are doing, right? Because the classic example I think is, it keeps coming up, for me at least, is everyone says, nobody uses Fedora for servers. And lots of people apparently have actually run into people running Fedora as servers. I think that indicates that we don't really know what people want to do and what they're using it for, and that we need to gather metrics. Going back to the startup concept, data-driven decision making.
Where is a good place to look for that data?
Well, I don't think it exists. So I think what we need to do is, I kind of suggested it in one of the other meetings, was start a metrics working group and actually have a target and have it be something that's important to the Fedora board to say, let's invest some resources in gathering data about what's going on.
We're starting to do a user survey for some work on that in the Fedora board, so that seems like that's the kernel of the metrics working group. So let's.
Right. So I think surveys are a good thing. The big thing that if you think about startups, the reason they you've probably seen it, right? More and more applications are saying, hey, can we track your anonymous usage data? Surveys have problems, right?
No, I'm not saying the survey is the answer. I'm saying if there are people interested in this,
there's a start.
We can build from there.
So here's some bullets of some things that I've been playing around with. So one of the ways that we can get save state, right, is can we actually run for every developer their own Mozilla sync server, so that I can actually point Firefox at the sync server, locally and have essentially per project profiles so that then I could have all of the windows and tabs I had open for a particular task saved away, right? And then be able to reopen them. So getting things known. Add some backends for that so that it can talk to bug trackers, or alternately rip out the backend and replace it with task order because it already does a lot of that stuff. And there's already like an extension built that will surface getting things known tasks in GNOME as kind of, it's part of your calendar. But start to work on that kind of stuff. So this is some stuff I've been playing with, and I highly encourage anyone else to play with. This is kind of getting file system mounting. I just kind of threw NFS here, but it doesn't matter. It's just, here's one option for implementation.
Is this not already a thing?
What?
Doesn't it have easy NFS?
No.
Oh.
It has
It did.
SFTP, a whole bunch of others, but not NFS.
Not the sharing side. Connection
Oh.
side. Sharing
Well,
side.
it has the
Oh, right.
We have file sharing.
Well, I couldn't figure out how to make it work. Let's put it that way.
Actually,
So, I could be an idiot. Don't get me wrong. The other one that this one I struggle with is lots and lots of people are going to Sublime text editor. If you haven't seen it, it's really cool. I don't understand why we don't have, like, to the best of my knowledge, there is no kind of open source competitor. One of the really nice things about Sublime that it does is it actually has a plugin model. First of all, it has a plugin model, which is nice, but the plugin model is API compliant with another, I meant to look it up this morning, I forgot, another editor that has also a ton of plugins. So I think it'd be really, really cool if we had, I don't know if it's gedit, right, or if it's some variant of gedit that, that also follows that same plugin model so that we could reuse all those plugins and provide some of those toolchain. I struggle with this because we have Emacs and we have Vim, right, and a lot of people use those. But I do see people abandoning VI Vim to go to Sublime. Sublime runs on Linux, and it's pretty nice. The other big thing is that I really think we could use some help and really work on documentation for GNOME and doing development against GNOME. Because right now it's really hard because it's changed so much in the past few years. And tracking down the documentation against the API and that kind of stuff is really, really difficult.
And I think that we have docs team people who are interested in helping with that, they just don't know how to connect, so that's a communication problem.
Okay. So now I have my best slide. So I don't know, thoughts, questions, comments?
On the last slide, is it the documentation for the GNOME APIs, or is it
Right.
general?
No, I don't necessarily mean to like build GNOME as much as I mean to be able to like extend it. So I want to write my own online accounts provider, right? The only thing I actually found was a document that said we don't want people writing their own, right? Being able to write extensions that don't break, and finding. So I was trying to write an extension for TuneD so that you could just switch. You guys know TuneD? It's like a power profile changer. It kind of replaced CPU Freak, but
it replaced K-tuning and a whole bunch of.
Okay, so I was trying to write a little extension that I could have a little drop down, and Matthew Garrett was going to kill me for doing this, but that had a little drop down that would let you switch profiles, and to do that you need privileged operation. I found, I think, 5 different ways of basically getting a little pop-up box to prompt you for a password for sudo, 4 of which crash GNOME every time. But no way to know which one of these I should use, right? So, I don't know, do you have a question?
Well, I have a concern around complexity. I really like the GNOME desktop, the ease of use of doing things, but there are times when having what's going on underneath be opaque means I can't fix it when it goes wrong.
Mm-hmm.
I can't tweak it if I need to do something a little bit more advanced than the existing tools will do. And look at the example of NFS. to do that right, you need to have firewalls right, you need to have the tunneling right. So for VMs, especially if you're doing it in the VM, then you need to have the ID mapper working correctly between the VM and the host. There's a whole pile of really subtle configuration that you can easily get wrong, or you can easily step on other things which are going on if you do that. So a lot of these things, they look nice at the user interface level, but to implement them, there's some really serious technical work needed to go on underneath. And there's, although it's easy to do a kind of gloss, to do it in a way which is also debuggable is really challenging. Have you any comments on that? I don't know if the people that you're targeting here want to see that level of complexity, or they really just want it to be completely hidden and don't want anything to do with it.
Well, I think it's a fine line. That's the problem, right? I mean, my stupid example that I think is simpler is so I often run VMs on my desktop. When I'm running a VM, I want it to be almost full screen. In other words, I want to still be able to see my top bar for notification, essentially. Time, weather, that kind of stuff. Because now the display change the display size only shows you kind of what are obviously available, and there's no way to just type in kind of a screen resolution. That's incredibly difficult to do, especially because there's also no I can't remember xconf right anymore. So now I have like these weird xrender commands that I have to put into GDM to make that new display resolution available. When it could just as easily have been that there was still a text box that I could just type into, right? So that's kind of, like I said, I think it's a simpler example of the same thing, is that last step of kind of taking away complexity makes it difficult. I don't know.
It seems like the Dev Assist tool could be a good place to stuff a lot of this. I just dove into it yesterday, and it can set up Docker containers for your favorite frameworks, sync with GitHub, set up your vimrc, emacsrc. It seems like a lot of that could be stuffed in there.
Yeah, and I've been highly encouraging that to occur. But yeah, exactly. I think it would be, one of the things I like about Dev Assistant is that it's kind of like Yum in the sense of it gives you kind of one CLI or GUI to kind of accomplish lots of different kinds of tasks without having to know how to do it individually, which is, I actually use Dev Assistant in the Polyglot talk, right? It's like when you have to jump and create a new Ruby project, do you really need to remember that for this kind of project you need a gem file, and that's how you indicate dependencies, and you need gems, and you need to remember the command line for that, and do you use RVM, or do you use some other mechanism to do virtual environments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And remembering that between, say, just Python and Ruby is really difficult.
So I see that we have at least a quorum of the Fedora Workstation Working Group in here. Could you guys raise your hands? Yeah, lots. So there's this idea of focusing on a niche rather than the entire. This seems different from it's a desktop for everyone, and we're leaning towards developers, versus let's focus at the niche and other people can use it, but we're really focusing on the niche.
What do you mean, at the expense of the others?
If necessary, right?
All right.
Isn't that what you're saying?
Yeah, that's my argument.
So
because
it's different. If necessary, at the expense of others, not just gratuitously, but
we don't want to actively hate people.
No, sure.
But
so I think that's controversial, and so I want to know if everybody's being quiet about that because they are going to go back later and say, well, screw that guy, or what's the reception to that? Because,
Well, I think you kind of have to still produce a desktop that works, right? That developers are users too, and they're going to OS X because the rest of the system doesn't break.
We've got a desktop that works. GNOME 3 works great, so I'm done. And there's more to do, but I think we're at that baseline.
But I mean, I think it's sometimes I think we need a concrete question in some sense, right? Like, okay, we want to change